Alright, so we're going to look at setting up BurpSuite as a client-side proxy between the browser and the website. So the way this is going to work is you're going to have a normal browser. It doesn't matter which browser you use. Doesn't seem to be any advantage to using one particular browser over another. I use Firefox because it has a lot of add-ons that you can plug in that are also useful, but there's no reason you can't use Internet Explorer as the browser. So BurpSuite is a program. It's Java based. It'll run on any operating system that has the Java framework installed on it. So the Java version on Linux I think needs to be maybe like 6, and on Windows it doesn't seem to matter if it's 6 or 7. It runs as an independent program outside of the browser, so it's not like the proxies that plug into Internet Explorer. With those, they do give you some control and certainly a lot of features that you're not going to get with the browser, but they do not give you total control over the requests and the responses because the plugins themselves are limited to what the browser can provide. So if you're using one of those proxies that is in the actual browser itself, just know that that program is not going to be able to do any more than the browser lets it. And BurpSuite is independent. It's not constricted that way. So first thing I want to do is talk about the setup, how to install it. Okay, if you're using Linux, it's a little bit easier as far as downloading and installing because you can do it with one command. So that's going to be apt-get and install and then BurpSuite. And that's if you're using Backtrack, the Backtrack version of Linux. And then you hit basically enter. And then if I was on the internet, it'll go out and find it. I don't think it has a hyphen in it actually. So yeah, so it's just all one word. If you're on Windows, what you do is you'll just download the jar file and save it somewhere. And then once you get the file, just open up your Programs 86 folder and create a new folder called BurpSuite and drop the jar file inside. Right click it and send a shortcut to your desktop. There's really no installation, it's just a jar, so it's not an executable. It doesn't need to be registered or anything like that, so there's not going to be kind of MSI to install it or anything. It's just a simple drag and drop. So we've installed it on Linux for no particular reason. It makes no difference. And we're using Firefox as the browser. And then I got BurpSuite running. So we need to connect the two together because by default your browser is going to want to go talk to the website, to the web server. And you need to let BurpSuite get in between those two so that you can intercept all the requests and the responses. First note on BurpSuite what it's listening to. So by default, it's going to listen to localhost on port 8080. You can change that if you go to the Proxy tab and then the Options tab and look at the listeners. Then that's where you're going to set up the proxy listener to listen for the web browser to do something, to make a request. And like I said, by default it's on 8080 and we're just going to leave that. So we have to come over here to, in this case, Firefox and set up a proxy. And in Firefox it's under the Advanced Main tab, the Network sub tab, and then under the connection area there's a settings button. And we're going to set that to manual proxy configuration, and we're going to place in the values that we had over in BurpSuite where it's listening. So it's listening to localhost in 8080. Pseudonym for localhost is 127.0.0.1. You can do it that way if you want. Doesn't really make any difference. On both Windows and Linux, localhost is already in your host file, so that'll work fine. Now down here where it says no proxy for, probably just want to blank that out. It's not entirely necessary sometimes, but just in case. Depends on how your web server is set up. Sometimes people are actually running the web server on their, literally on their host, their machine. They're doing development locally and then they push the changes later. It can mess with them if you don't clear that box out. In Internet Explorer, it's going to be under Tools, Options, Connections, and click on, I think, LAN Settings and go from there. So right now, if we send a request to a website, it should go through BurpSuite first, and then BurpSuite will forward it on down the line to the website automatically. So our listeners listening, there's a little checkbox here where you can turn it on and off. That way you can have multiple listeners set up and then pick between them. So if we stay on the Proxy main tab and switch over to the Intercept subtab, we can also see that the intercept is on. So we can turn that off and then try to make a request and just make sure we can connect to the web server still. So maybe we change the page or something like that just to be sure it's not coming from cache. Seems to be working. Now if we turn the intercept on and then fill out the form and submit it, we should be able to trap that request. So we put in this case, it's a username and a password form, happens to be, hit login. And notice that down at the bottom, BurpSuite kind of lit up a little bit. So if we click over to that, we can see in the Proxy main tab, Intercept subtab, that the request has been caught. So as a web developer, this is key because in order to be able to actually see what your web browser is sending over to the server, you need to capture it outside of the browser. If you're using tools inside the browser, you can't really be sure what it's telling you is being sent is 100% accurate, and there's probably going to be missing information. But this is raw HTTP that's been captured after it's already left the browser. So this is real. This is what's actually being sent over to the web server. Now once we let it leave BurpSuite and go to the web server is going to process the request and then hopefully return a response. So we'll go ahead and forward this, and we're forwarding the request to the web server. And the web server responded that we had the wrong username and password. So what if we want to catch the response too? In other words, we want to catch both the request going out and the response coming back in. If you go over, still stay in the Proxy tab and go over to the Options tab, scroll down a little bit, there's two different sections. One of them controls intercepting the request, and the second section controls intercepting the responses. Now right now you can see that intercepting the request is checked, but intercepting the responses is not. That's why when the response came back, we didn't trap that. So if we want to see what the web server responded, which is typically what a developer wants to do, they want to see how the request was processed by their ASP.NET or Java or whatever. We want to check this box. And then also, you probably want to set up what causes, which files are actually trapped. By default, it's just going to say if the content type is text of some kind. So it's going to avoid binary files, things like images and stuff like that. And that works pretty well. It should be able to trap this request. Okay, so we got the request. Go back to the Intercept tab. Here's the request to the web server. We'll forward that. And then here's the response that came back. Now the response is trapped inside of BurpSuite. It hasn't actually gotten back to the browser yet. So if you go look over at the browser is still got the little waiting icon up here in the bar, and it's just waiting. It doesn't know that the web server hasn't, it thinks the web server hasn't responded yet. It has no idea that we've actually caught the request before it made it back. So here you can actually look at all the code, and probably just as importantly, you can see the headers that were returned by the server. Once this gets back to the browser, you can still see a lot of the code by doing a view source, but you're not going to see these headers. Those are stripped out because they're not part of the actual content. So the content starts 2 lines after the end of the header down here. When you do a view source, that's what you're going to see. But a lot of times you need to know the information up here at the top in order to diagnose a problem. So we'll forward this back to the browser. And then the browser, before we can even click over, the browser already takes all that HTML and renders it on the page. So that's the basic idea is we want to be able to intercept all the communications between the browser and the server in order to be able to look at it, diagnose issues, troubleshoot, figure out what the code does, those kind of things. All right, any questions so far on just getting it set up, getting it to work, getting it to actually intercept and that kind of thing? Okay. So next thing we're going to look at is some of the options, because these come in pretty handy. I don't usually mess with the listener too much unless there's some kind of contention. You know, maybe there's something else running on 8080 and I'll change it to 8088 or something like that, but otherwise I generally don't mess with the listeners. As far as the requests and the responses go, it's usually a good idea if you're in a complicated environment to filter what you trap so that you don't end up trapping all the stuff going off to Google in the background and all the different checks to the proxy and all this other noise while you're trying to debug your site. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and set up the requests and the responses approximately the same way. And the first thing I'll do is I'll check off that the URL needs to be in the target scope, and then using the up button here, move that up to the top so that that's the first match. And then I'll leave the second match, the default match, to the file extension doesn't match a GIF or a JPEG or a PNG or that kind of stuff. I typically edit the second rule. You can highlight the rule and then click edit. And then I'll just add on to the end, move the cursor out of the way for you. I'll add the longhand JPEG extension, because there's still a lot of JPEGs out there I found that have that 4-letter extension instead of the 3-letter extension. And it's really irritating when you intercept those and it's just a bunch of blah, you know, it's like binary garbage or whatever. I mean, maybe you want to see the JPEGs, but usually not. All right, so that rule's set up. And we can repeat that down here at the bottom. So if we uncheck the default rule, and then we check the URL is in target scope, and move that up to the top. And then we can create the rule that matches the file extension one up here. So we'll say add, and actually to make it easier, I'm going to go back up and edit the rule we already have and just copy this stuff out so I don't have to retype it. Go down here, add the rule, and then paste those match conditions. And so we want to say and the file extension is not one of these, so it does not match. And then move that rule up to be number 2. Technically, it wouldn't matter in this case that we didn't move the rule up because none of the other intermediate rules were checked off anyway, so it would have skipped them all anyhow. But just as to keep it clean and neat, I like to just try to keep these tabs the same and keep my rules in order and stuff like that. Makes a little less chance of mistakes. So if we go back to the intercept tab, the intercept is on, but it's not going to intercept anything anymore because of that target scope thing. I'll explain why in a second. So we'll just hit login, same way we've been doing. And the page processes normally. No interception, even though the intercept is on. And that's because of that target scope rule. If we go over to the target tab, which is the first tab, and we find our site in the list of sites, which is this one here, and we right click on the URL and then say add to scope, it'll place this site, our site, into the scope. You can modify the scope manually here on the scope tab. It's next to the sitemap tab. But you can see by right clicking on the actual URL and saying add to scope, it automatically wrote the rule in place for us. Every once in a while you'll want to add one of these rules to put some kind of a site into your development scope manually. It uses regular expressions. Typically I'll take a rule that already I know is working, like one of them that the tool created itself, and just modify it slightly so it takes the guesswork out of it. Usually the reason you would add a site into the target scope is because you want to make sure that you pick up maybe just certain subdomains or something like that. Like you don't want to pick up every little page, especially when it comes to sites that are like mashups where you may actually have 2 or 3 different kinds of AJAX requests going on in the background, going to 3 or 4 different domains. Now notice as we've been browsing the site, whether we intercepted it or not, BurpSuite's been recording all of that traffic over here on the target tab. So everything that happened is being written down, and we can go back later and we can look at the requests in the target tab window here, and then also the responses that came back. In addition to being able to look at the response in the raw form, we can go over here and click on the render, and it'll go ahead and draw as best as it can the actual browser view of the site in the tab.
Does it record the traffic if the intercept is off?
Yes, it will not pause the request and the response for you, but it will go ahead and at least write it down for you. So, and that goes for every request and every response, even if it's not in scope. So you can see down here these items that it recorded the potential to go to these sites, even though we haven't actually gone to them. The reason they're gray is because we haven't actually visited these sites yet. These were anchor tags that are on the pages that we visited, and it goes ahead and it writes down all the anchor tags that it sees and places them over here on the left as grayed out items, indicating these are sites you can go to from these pages but that you haven't actually visited yet. If you click on one of the hyperlinks and actually visit the site, the link over here will turn this like kind of dark black color like you see up here. It's probably hard to tell on the screen, but there is pretty good contrast if you're looking at your own computer. Now, a lot of times sites will, in the background, they'll go out to all these different sites getting all kinds of information and stuff. And that's a great reason to keep that target scope defined that you want to intercept, because otherwise you're going to be intercepting everything. It gets really annoying because you have to forward it or drop it in order to clear your screen. All right, so good question, and that's the target tab in general. Now, let's say that you don't want to have to literally walk through your site, you know, one click at a time. You just want to get a picture of your site overall, and then maybe search through all the requests or search through the responses later. So on the target tab, you can right-click and say spider, and it'll go ahead and it'll walk the site for you. Now, it may pop up some questions like, you know, it'll say there's a form on this page and I don't know what to type in, and then you can manually type stuff in, and that way it'll go ahead and submit it and keep walking through the site. But more or less it's automated. Now in the Pro version there's some extra tools. Note that in this demo I'm using the free version on purpose because I want everybody to see what you can do with the version that you'll have by default. But if you require the other functionality, like the ability to actually do a search through every single page looking for keywords or something like that, you can get the Pro version. I think it's $300 or something like that. But all of these features here all come with the free version. So a lot of developers, at least at first, really don't need the pay version right away. Later on they might. All right, so let's go back to the proxy and try our interception again since we have that turned on. Okay, since the target's back in scope, we're able to intercept it again, forward it, wait for the response, forward that back to the browser. Now it's the same tab that's intercepting the requests and the responses, so you kind of got to keep it straight in your head which direction things are going. So it's, but you can tell, if you get kind of lost, you can tell. So if we hit login, see it says that it's request to right up here in the status bar, and we can forward it, and then later you can see it says response from. So you can sort of keep track of which direction the traffic's going by paying attention to the status. There's a history over here, which is, it is similar to what you were talking about in the target tab, where does it really record it if you don't intercept it? Well, over here in this history, this is only what was intercepted. So if you want to see everything that's happened, it's the target tab. But if you just want to look at the traffic that you captured, it's over here in the proxy history tab. And then we already looked at the options tab. So I am looking at the tabs out of order. There's a reason for that. It's a little bit smoother if we look at it this way. So, okay, so now what are some of the things we can do beyond trapping the requests and the responses? Well, actually, that's pretty useful. There's a lot of problems that are hard to solve, especially in servers like Cold Fusion, where the server is doing so much for you, or maybe your opinion is it's doing it to you. Just depends on your perspective. And you don't really know what's going on. You can't tell what the server's doing. So it's helpful if you can see the response in the raw form and trap it and look at it before it gets back to the browser where you can't see it anymore, to sort of diagnose some problems. We ran into that a couple weeks ago. All right, so you can also drop the request too if you want. That comes in handy sometimes. All right, over on the spider tab, when you say spider a site, so if we went over here and said right click, spider this host, ignore form. If we go back over here to the spider tab, this is where you can see the spider at work, and it tries to guess as best as it can how many requests are remaining. So it's kind of sticking somewhere around 100 or something like that, and it's now dropped down to, I guess, 55. And it'll keep asking you, do you want to fill in these values for these forms that I found? It's giving you a chance to fill it in because maybe there's some pages on the other side of the form that you can only get to if you actually submit the form. Otherwise, you can hit ignore form. Okay. The reason that the requests keep going up and down is because BurpSuite is keeping track of all the pages it knows that it has to process so far, but every time it visits a new page, there's always a chance that there's yet another series of pages linked off of that page, you know, a bunch of anchor tags or hyperlinks or whatever. So this count's going to be kind of relative to where it's at right now. And then under the spider options tab is a whole lot of options that you can use to control the spider. You can come down here and do the application login so it can get past the login screens. Set up how aggressive the spider is. Look at the request headers. And then also control some of the pages that it'll find. You can also have it automatically replace certain headers and do some advanced stuff like that. It does have a vulnerability scanner built into it, but the automated scanner is in the paid version only. So it'll automatically check for cross-site scripting and SQL injection and other vulnerabilities for you and do a lot of your QA automatically, but that is in the paid version. So let's look at some of the free stuff. Okay, I'm going to trap a request that we can use as a guinea pig. So this is a request going out to the web server. If you right click somewhere in the window, you're going to get a bunch of options. You can send this page to the spider to act as the very first page of a spidering. You can send it over to the Intruder tab, the Repeater tab, and then these other tabs as well. I'm going to skip over the Intruder for now. First one I want to look at is the Repeater tab. This is really handy for developers, so we'll look at that first. Okay, so I've sent this request, I've trapped this request, and then I've sent it over to the Repeater tab. If we look at the tab, you can see that there's a copy of it over here. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the proxy and let this trapped request just go about its way, and we can disregard it. In the browser, you'll see that the web server responded and it rendered the page. Over here in the Repeater tab, this request that we trapped is in the request window at the top, and there's a response window at the bottom. To send the request over to the web server, we can hit the go button, and then the response will come back down here at the bottom. You can hit the render to see what's going on. There's also these intermediate tabs I kind of glossed over a little bit. They're pretty handy. They're not the ones that I use the most. I definitely use the raw and the render more than anything. But the headers tab is nice. You can see the headers here. They're not hidden or anything. But if you click on the headers tab, it organizes them for you. So I'll need to expand this window a little bit so you can see better. But you can see that the headers are all listed out in a nice chart. There's also the hex tab, which comes in handy sometimes when you're looking at binary files, not so much useful for HTML necessarily. And then there's the HTML tab. The HTML tab is almost exactly like what a view source is going to show you in the browser. And then, of course, we already covered the render tab. The usefulness of the repeater tab is that we can send the same exact request over and over again without having to use the browser. So you can just keep hitting go and keep getting back the response. But that's not really where the most usefulness is. You can actually change the request and then just hit go again and then immediately see how that changes the response. There's also search bars down here at the bottom where you can put a keyword. And over here at the bottom right, it'll tell you if there's any matches. And that's pretty much in real time. So if we come up here to the request and we change it to have the username be canary and then hit go and then click down here, I get crickets. All right, good demo. Let me try again. Let's see. If we need something that's going to be reflected back in the response. That might be a bad example. Might need to get a different page. I think in this site the username's not reflected back. In other words, it doesn't keep your username written down for you in the field, so you don't have to fill it out. You actually have to type it in every single time. Alright, let's see. We got... I'll just grab a different page. So let's go turn the proxy intercept on, go back to the site, go to a page that we know is going to have reflection. So you'll go to this lookup tool. Okay, looks like the intercept worked. Right click, send a repeater, and then I'm going to let this trapped request go about its way. Go back over the repeater tab. Let's do even better. Let's go ahead and trap something more interesting, like an actual, somebody fills out a form and makes a request. So proxy intercept on, make your request. Right click in the request and send the repeater. And let me set everything back up. Okay, there we go. So in this case, I sent the word canary in the request just to have something to search for in the response from the server. The server does include the tool ID variable back in the response in the JSON. So down here you can see when I click in this little field, it says there's one match. So I'll change it to like canary 1, send it on its way, and it updates in real time. You don't even have to actually click down in here. Just pretty nice. If there's more than one instance of what it's looking for, you can hit the forward and back buttons down here to move back and forth through the search. So let's see what would happen if we sent in, I don't know, some test values. So some common test values might be, you might test for numbers that are too big, for example. So you can put in the number that's too big, hit go, and see how the site responds to it. Looks like it didn't make any difference. It just treats the number as text, so there was no harm to this particular site. All right, so that's the repeater tab. You still have the parameters, the headers, and the hex. The parameters tab will just contain the parameters for the page, but it's kind of nice because it puts them all in one place. So there's a URL parameter, there's 2 cookie parameters, and then there's 2 form parameters, or what it calls body parameters, because they're being passed. You can actually change the type. So you can say, well, move this URL parameter into as a post parameter, for example. And if you go back over here to the raw, you can see that that parameter that used to be up here in the URL has actually been moved down here into the post. So there's a way to check for problems like get for post and things like that. You can change the values. So maybe we want to change the show hints cookie from a 0 to a 1 to see what happens in testing. If you go back over here and look at the cookie, you can see it changed it. Of course, you can also just type in right here anyway. So you could change it like right there as well. You can type over anything. You can do anything you want to the request, then hit go, and it'll come back in the response. This one's kind of interesting because when we changed the show hints parameter, it actually changed the way the page is rendered. And it shows a bunch of hints, as you might imagine. That's all fine and good. Well, before I leave this page, actually, let's look at one more thing. The request in browser is kind of neat. So once you get the response you're looking for, then you can hit request in browser in current browser session. Copy this URL, and then go over to your browser and open up. You can open up a new tab and paste that URL in there, and it'll show you what it had recorded. So when it takes, it's essentially what it does is it's almost like it takes a little snapshot of the page, if you will, and has like a basically like a web server running, and then you can go look at that recording. So you could save that and then save that response from the server in your notes and then come back later and look at it if you wanted. And in the pay version, there's actually a save state where all these different tabs that have all this information you've collected over the process of doing some kind of QA or analysis or troubleshooting, you can save that off into a file and then bring it back in later. But that's in the Pro only. All right, so the repeater tab is great for troubleshooting, spot checking, things like that. The only problem is that if you're trying to do some kind of quality assurance, it's going to get real tiring because there's a lot of pages in the site and there's a lot of things you have to manually type in. Plus, you know, as part of your QA, for example, in an integer field, you need to check for someone typing in letters and symbols, plus a whole bunch of different kinds of numbers. It's going to get real tedious to type a bunch of negative numbers, a bunch of zeros, a bunch of positive numbers, a bunch of really big numbers, so on and so forth. So if we send this request over to the Intruder tab, we can put some automation behind the repeater. You can right-click inside the repeater and say Send to Intruder. You don't actually have to go back and retrap the request again. Once you get the request trapped, you can send them around to these different tabs just by right-clicking. All right, in the Intruder tab, the request is going to be over here on the Positions tab, so the sub-tab Positions. And you'll see that it's highlighted a bunch of different stuff automatically. And in addition, it's put these little symbols around it. Those symbols are the places where the automated injections will occur. So I don't really necessarily want to inject the session ID because in most sites that would log you out. So I'm going to highlight that area and hit the clear button over here on the right. And that'll take that session ID off as a target. But I can still leave the show hints as a target. And then I'm going to go ahead and take all of these parameters off as a target as well, although normally you would definitely be testing these parameters down here more than anything else. But just for demonstration, I want to keep it kind of simple and just target on one parameter. Now if you wanted to, you can highlight anything you want, say the host or whatever, and you can add those special markers around it, effectively making that highlighted area a target for automated injection. But I'm just going to go ahead and clear those off too. Okay, so right now the only thing that's going to get modified in each request automatically is whatever is between those two symbols. Right now it's just the show hints. Now notice by default that there's a 2 between those symbols right now. I could delete the 2 and then the default request would just be blank. I can leave the 2 in there. The default request will be the number 2. What it'll do is it'll make this request one time and use that as a baseline. It'll even mark it as the baseline. It'll say, well, this is the original. And then it'll make requests with all the iterations of the test data and compare those for you to the original. It'll show you how much how much content came back and all that kind of stuff. We'll do that in an example because it's a little easier to see. On the attack type, at first you probably want to leave it as the sniper, but there are 3 other choices. We can look at those later. What the sniper is going to do is it's going to pick each target and iterate all the test data through that one field. Then it'll move on to the second target and the third and the fourth, holding everything constant while it's working on the current field. But in these other types, that behavior is going to be different. So for example, in the pitchfork, it'll take the current target payload, let's say it's integers, and let's say it's on number 1. So, and you're testing 4 fields. It'll put a 1 in all 4 of the fields at the exact same time and then hit submit. It's different tests for different scenarios, but typically if you're trying to isolate what individual fields are doing and those fields don't have any connection to the other fields, like maybe one field is a name field and the other field's an address field and they don't have anything to do with each other, then typically the sniper is the best attack. Okay, over in the payloads, this is where you set up your test data. Now, if you're in QA and you already have your test data in a file, that's great. There's a load button right here, and you can load in your file, and it'll fill up this list. The Pro version of BurpSuite comes with a bunch of files already preloaded with all this different stuff in them. You can also have it generate the list for you. So there's only going to be one payload set in the sniper attack. And what that means is there's some attacks where, like say you're trying to test usernames and passwords at the exact same time, you know, those fields are related, right? Because they both have to be correct at the exact same time. Can't just get one or the other, hopefully. Guess you better test for that. But the idea here would be that if we're going to test like a username and a password field, we might want to pull like one file with a list of usernames and one file with a list of passwords, and then have those 2 payload sets coming in simultaneously. So you would go back over here to where it says sniper and then change that. Let's see, let's get 2 positions. Temporarily, I'm just going to add the session ID as a target just so we have 2 targets. Make sure I'm doing this right. Ah, there we go. I think I had the pitchfork and the battering ram flipped. So you can see how now there's 2 different payload sets because one payload set's going to go at one field and the other payload set's going to go at the other field simultaneously. That's also useful in certain business situations where basically the 2 fields that you're testing are different. They're not going to have the exact same data in them, but they're related. Put this back to the way it was. Okay, so our payload target is still that cookie. We're on the sniper, there's only one payload set. In the payload type, there's a lot of them that come in here by default, even on the free version. So some of the really useful ones would be like character substitutions. Maybe you want to do case modification, like you want to test different variations of upper and lower case automatically. There's character blocks, there's numbers and dates. It's not kind of obvious when you'd want to use dates. Maybe you have a date field. So let's do numbers. So when you pick numbers down here in the payload options, you get to set up the options for the numbers. Now the payload options is going to depend on which of those drop downs you pick. If you pick characters or whatever, it's obviously going to let you select like, well, what's your range of characters, A through Z or what. So in this case, why don't we just do sequential numbers, and we'll do from, I don't know, how about -4 to +10, and we'll step 2, for example. And we're going to use decimal numbers instead of hex. So the minimum integer digits in this case would be 1, and the maximum would be 2. There's not going to be any fractions. I don't know if you notice down here in the examples, it kind of gives you a hint about what kind of numbers that might be. So if we change the minimum fraction digits to 1, you see how it adds a 0.1 on here? and then if we change the maximum fraction digits like 4, it should be like dot, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 5 or whatever. So you can even iterate through the tens place and the hundreds place and the thousands place. Maybe you're working on some kind of a system that has a currency field in it, and you want to see what happens when the user doesn't type in, you know, the 100 spot. So you would test the 10 spot, the 100 spot, and then also you might want to see what the program does if you type in 3 numbers after the decimal. Does it round it? What's it do? Then unless you want to sit there all day and type it in manually, this might be a good choice. Okay. On the payload processing, you can set up rules to basically look for stuff or to modify things or change things. It's kind of an advanced technique, but it can come in useful sometimes. All right, so we have our test set up. Over here in the options, this is where you set up whether it's going to store and record the requests and the responses. And I like these matches they have. You can add anything you want to this list, but the default list is pretty nice. So if the word error, for example, comes back in the response, it's going to flag that and say, hey, the word error came back in response number 42 or whatever. So this is going to be really important because in your all's test cases, there's probably going to be thousands and thousands of requests that you're going to send over the course of a few minutes. And they're all going to come back with responses, hopefully. If not, probably need to figure out why the web server didn't respond. But if they do come back and only 6 of them have an error in it, you're not going to want to look through all those responses trying to find that. So you would put whatever your error message is, or just leave the word error or whatever, or exception. But check off the flag result items box to make sure that you actually see those flagged when they come back. Now if you're doing tests for like cross-site scripting or whatever, there's an important one to check down here where it says grep payloads. You want to check off the search responses for the payload strings, because that's one of the sure signs of cross-site scripting is you send in some kind of code into an input field and exactly what you typed in is reflected back. In other words, it was never encoded by the developer. Critical mistake. And there's a lot of other options too as well. But let's use this test for now. We've already covered a lot of material. Okay, to start the test, we'll go to Intruder and Start. It's going to give us a warning message because this is the free version. It's going to tell you that these attacks are time throttled. Essentially, hit OK. Essentially, the way it works is it's pretty fast at first, but when you get to like 100 or something like that, it starts to slow down, and so the requests don't happen as frequently. Also, even the initial first 10 requests, even though they did go pretty fast, even those are time throttled. It's just that at first the time is not very long between the requests. In the paid version, it'll do 10 requests and like as soon as you can click the button, it's super fast. So we got back basically 9 requests. And we got request number 1 was -4, and then it counted by 2s all the way up to 10. And that makes sense because we said start at -4, go to 10, step 2, right? In the error column, you can see that those are all checked off. That means that the word error appears somewhere in every one of these responses, along with the word invalid, fail, exception, and so on. And there's all those other keywords that we were looking for as well. Over here on the far right, under comments, that's the baseline request. That's where it sent in the default unaltered request. That's the comparison. Usually what I'll do is I'll sort by the length, because at least in the type of testing I'm doing, the length of the page is a really good indicator if something is different. So in an ideal world, if you're doing security testing, for example, then every single page would respond exactly the same no matter what anyone types in. But in real life, sometimes you can type in something special that'll get the site to act different, and those are the ones that are key to a security researcher or a pen tester. When the page acts exactly the same, then you can be pretty sure that the site ignored your input, handled your input gracefully, processed it properly, whatever. So you want to look for areas where the length is different. So the baseline request has a length of 32, but all these subsequent requests have at least 20,000 more characters. That's a big difference. And then there's a couple of requests that actually have about another 11,000 characters over that. So we'd want to investigate these borders right here and figure out what the difference is. All right, so we're just going to pick a couple of them to look at. On request number 8 with payload 10, look at the response and render it. I usually just do a render real quick and see if I can pick up something visually. If not, you can go back and look through the code. All right. Okay, so that's all fine and dandy for request number 10. See, there's a lot of scribble on the page. Let's compare that to the baseline, which was only 32,000 in length. Highlight that, hit the response, render. Okay, so visually, I don't know if y'all saw this, but on the other page there was a bunch of garbage below the button, and on this page you can see it's just blank. So why is that garbage there? Well, you found something that's different, so now you go in and you start investigating. Well, that's kind of tedious to have to scroll up and down and look at all that, right? I agree. All right, so what you can do is you can right-click on your finding and send that over to the comparer. And so we want to compare, in this case, the responses. We were looking at the two different responses. So we'll right-click on that, select compare the response for that one, and then let's pick number 8. Right-click, compare response. We'll shrink down the results tab, go back over to the main BurpSuite site and switch over to the compare tab over here. And we have the first request highlighted in item number 1 box, and then in item number 2 box we have the second request, and we're going to compare words, or you can compare bytes, either way. Words works for text, bytes works better for non-text files. One of the buttons I like to click right away is the sync views button down here, because when you pull the scroll bar up and down, that sync views will keep them scrolling at the same rate. So these red areas are areas where there's the same amount of characters in both sides, but the value is different. Or it may not necessarily be the same amount. It's the characters are between, both of these are the attribute of a title tag, for example. And we're basically looking for blue or yellow to see if something was deleted or added. Okay, or modified. So on the page on the right, you can see there's a lot more information on that page that was output than there is over here on the left-hand side. Those two are clearly different. Now, as to why they're different, it'll be different for each site. And of course, everybody's testing their own site. It's highly contextual, but it's not really a problem. Developers know what their sites do, so they know what they're looking for. Some other tabs that are pretty handy is the sequencer. What it'll do is if you, like in the Intruder, if you tell it which field to look at, it'll make a whole bunch of requests really, really quickly and then capture what the web server sent back in the response. So let's just say that you created a random number generator for some reason, and you want to figure out how random is my random number generator. You would just highlight that field and have it say do 20,000 requests. It'll write down all the numbers that come back and then compare them to one another and tell you how random they really are. And it has some pretty sophisticated algorithms it does too. It's not just one algorithm. So we can see if we can get that to work. I'm going to get a new request. I'll go back to the login page. Alright, so let's go back to Proxy, turn the intercept on. Just do a refresh. Back over here so we can get a request. Okay, I'm going to say send a sequencer. And it's got the request up here. And it wants to know which token are you looking for. What's the location of that token within the response? I'm going to go ahead and send this forward to get the response. Let's see, let's clear the cookies out because we're not getting the set cookie statement. And that's going to be pretty helpful. I'm going to drop this one. Alright, see if we can get the site to issue a cookie. So we'll go up and clear the cookies. And probably one of the easiest way to do that is just close the browser. I was looking for a cookie editor, so we could just hit the clear button, but I don't think I've actually installed it in Firefox yet, or Cookie Manager Plus. Okay, we'll do a get, forward that. There's the set cookie statement I was looking for with the PHP session ID in it. Right click and send this to sequencer. So we'll remove that one. Okay, so we're going to say the token location is in the cookie field. We know that. But there's two different cookies that were issued. So in the drop down box, I'm going to pick the PHP session ID. Alright, let me turn off the proxy. Or I'll just drop this one. Don't want it messing with us. And I'm going to hit Start Live Capture. And up here at the top is a little counter. And since the session token is actually basically a random number, it's different each time that you do a request. BurpSuite is smart enough to where it'll purposely not send a cookie in the request to make sure that the web server gives it a cookie in the response. Because if you've already logged in and you already have a cookie and you send that cookie, the web server is not going to give you a new cookie. That would log you out. It's going to, it's just going to not have a set cookie statement at all. So the tool knows this, and it'll purposely not send a cookie in order to elicit responses. When you get enough of them, you can either hit auto analyze, like say every 200 or something, which is configurable, or you can hit analyze now if you're impatient or you got enough of them. And then it'll go ahead and it'll measure the entropy, the randomness, tell you how many bits there are. Let me turn off auto analyze. Actually, let me just pause the whole thing. It does the character level analysis and the bit level. Let's see, analyze now. I think some of these might be only in the paid version. Over here on the bit level analysis, it'll actually tell you like which of the bits are most commonly used, and it turns the ones that tend to be repeated a lot. It'll turn those red, and it'll lower the bar down so you can see in whatever PHP does, there are definitely some bits that tend to get lit up a whole lot more than random would suggest. But it's probably still random enough. And typically what I just use is the summary, and I get the effective entropy, which in this case is 120 bits. That's okay. Not the best, but you can capture a bunch of tokens and save them off and manually load them later, and then there's the analysis options over here about which tests that you want to do. All right, and then the last tab we're going to look at today is the Decoder tab. This one's pretty nice because it lets you convert something you type in. You can encode it as, say, URL or HTML or base64. It's really handy in testing. So if I like type in a bunch of, I don't know, symbols or whatever and stuff, and then say encode as URL, it'll convert everything over into the URL syntax that you would see in hyperlinks as a HTML query parameter, HTTP query parameter. You can encode it as HTML. This is good for testing. base64, so on and so forth. If you already have URL encoded stuff and you can't read it, then you would copy that. Let's see, let's encode it as, say, URL first. And then we can say, okay, well, I want to decode this stuff that I can't read, decode it as URL, and you can see it converts it back. That comes in pretty handy for testing in a lot of different scenarios. So the main tab I wanted to kind of show you was the Intruder tab, because that's the one that can do a lot of automation when it comes to QA. And it can allow developers to do a lot of testing that they're not doing now, because it's really not practical doing this kind of testing manually. If you're sitting in a browser and you're having to type in your test on Firefox or IE and hit submit and wait, that's painfully slow. It's not productive. It's not really a good expenditure of labor. You want to try to use a tool like this that does fuzzing, that you can set up a range of values to test and have it run through every one of them, and then also point out to you, perhaps most importantly, which of the actual responses were funny, which ones were different than the baseline in some meaningful way, or it contains some kind of a word or phrase that you can key in on that tells you something went wrong. Then you can just worry about what that particular payload was and throw away the rest of the results. So you should be able to do your immediate QA a lot quicker before you actually send it off to the QA teams. Then the QA teams, they really ought to have something like this, the paid version, so that they can just go to town on the site quickly. All right, is there any technical questions about how the tool works, or what the tool does, or what it's capable of? All right.